Welcome to a discussion on bilingual education. As we know, second language learning is a complex process. The research is vast and sometimes contradictory. Yet it is important that educators and the public at large be informed on some of the issues that deal with the linguistically diverse student in the United States. We have selected 4 issues that will highlight specific topics on second language acquisition and second language learning. First, we will discuss some of the history in the United States on bilingual education. Second, we will discuss who is the English language learner. The third presentation will focus on the models used in bilingual education. Fourth, Congress has recently passed legislation known as No Child Left Behind. Unfortunately, the discussions are minimal about what the legislation means for the linguistically diverse student. Our moderator this evening is Ms. Nancy Lopez Peralta. Ms. Lopez Peralta holds a master's degree in elementary education and taught bilingual kindergarten for 7 years. She is currently a dual language coordinator in the Bridgeport Public Schools in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I hope you enjoy the presentations. Ms. Peralta.
Thank you, Dr. Simoes. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. As Dr. Simoes mentioned, we have several bilingual education topics being presented by a panel of educators. All of our presenters have background experience working with English language learners. Please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Ms. Allison Spencer. Ms. Spencer holds a degree in Spanish education from Siena College and is currently working on earning a master's degree in TESOL at Fairfield University. Ms. Spencer's topic will revolve around the question, is bilingual education a new phenomenon in the United States, or is it embedded in our history? Ms. Spencer?
Thank you, Nancy. When it comes to the issue of bilingual education, America seems to have a case of historical amnesia. Many people think that it is a recent issue, when in fact it has been around since our country's very beginning. Throughout the history of this continent, there have been multiple languages spoken. But the history of being both bilingual and American has been like the pendulum of a clock, swinging back and forth, for then against, supporting and then opposing the needs of these bilingual students. Before any immigration occurred, the Americas were multilingual societies. Native Americans in North America spoke at least 200 to 300 indigenous languages, of which approximately 175 still survive in the continental United States. As settlers reached the New World, many different European languages added to the diversity of the country. The first settlement in the continental United States was actually a Spanish-speaking town called Española, now in New Mexico. This Spanish-speaking town was located a few miles north of the present-day Santa Fe and was settled 9 years before the English settlement of Jamestown, Virginia. This is 22 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. Many of these groups settled in rural areas and started schools in their own languages. For example, the Chinese in the West, Spanish in the South, German in the Midwest. The slaves also brought over many African languages, but because schooling was withheld and most were not permitted to speak in their native tongues, the languages were not passed on through the generations. The settlers' languages became dominant, and native languages began to die out. Almost 300 years later, many indigenous languages have disappeared, and those few that are still left are in danger of complete language extinction within the next 20 years. Although the native languages were repressed, the European languages flourished. And for much of the first 2 centuries, this country was a dynamic, multilingual, culturally diverse place. In 1839, Ohio became the first state to adopt a bilingual education law, which allowed German and English instruction upon the parents' request. Louisiana quickly followed suit and within 10 years had French and English instruction. Also, Mexican Americans had the right to speak Spanish under the Treaty of Hidalgo. Throughout the country, people spoke in their native languages, and in many places could go to bilingual schools. At this time, the mentality of some public schools and administrators felt that continuing the use of the mother tongue kept a family's traditions, aspirations, and customs alive. This built self-confidence and self-esteem, which led to inner strength, and through this, a better character. It was the late 1800s when the first backlash against bilingual or multicultural attitudes took shape. Public school became the place to Americanize people and form children into American citizens, or the perception of what that was at the time. One example of this is in the 1870s. Native American children abruptly began to be separated from their families. They were sent to boarding schools far away and not permitted to speak in their native tongues. Another example is in 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. This prohibited Chinese immigration for 10 years. As wave upon wave of European immigrants streamed into the country, first language use was more and more suppressed. By the end of the 1800s, legislation began to appear which forbid the use of another language in the public schools other than English. Bilingual education was almost decimated, despite the repeal of these laws in almost every state within 10 years. As the schools were expected to Americanize their students, they were also expected to prepare students for jobs in the emerging industrialized nation. In 1906, Congress even passed a law making English a requirement for naturalization. As we entered World War I, the anti-German sentiment quickly grew into open hostility toward all languages. By the mid-1920s, bilingual education was dead, disenfranchising many from a meaningful education. State after state enacted laws making English the only lawful language used in education, in the belief that this might control an emerging radical element in the labor movement. The widespread repression of native languages continued through the first half of the 1900s. Finally, after decades of this repression, the door to bilingual education and multiculturalism reopened with the arrival of Cuban immigrants in the 1950s and early 60s. A renaissance in bilingual education began to take hold. Spanish-speaking Cubans opened their own private schools in Miami, Florida, offering bilingual education in Spanish and English. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act made it clear that no federal funds would be given to an organization that discriminated against anyone based on race, color, or nationality. It also meant that people could not be excluded from participation in any program that received federal funding. This started a new drive to include students in the learning process whose first language was not English. In 1968, Title VII was passed. This was the Bilingual Education Act, which allowed use of the federal funding to create bilingual programs and train teachers. Many school districts started to explore ways to incorporate native language into daily instruction. Of course, there were many struggles in various states for native language instruction, such as with the Chicanos in Texas. Also in 1974, citing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Lau versus Nichols began its journey to the Supreme Court, seeking bilingual education for Chinese speakers in California. Taking the perspective that schools which did not provide special programs to language learners were not providing an equal education, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. And around the country, bilingual programs were almost mandated. Although many strides were made, and despite well-documented research supporting the effectiveness of bilingual education, momentum increased for the English-only movement in the face of this increasing diversity. Throughout the 1980s into the present, programs have been underfunded and dismantled. For example, recently California passed Proposition 227 in 1998, and this almost totally eliminated bilingual programs altogether. Presently, this is where we stand. English language learners are stuck. The data shows the number of English language learners is increasing exponentially. They are blamed for not succeeding in school when the American education system has not provided them with the tools nor the opportunity to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Spencer, for sharing interesting facts on the history of bilingual education. Our next presenter, Ms. Evelyn Ocasio, holds a Bachelor of Science degree from New Hampshire College and has a master's degree in bilingual education from Fairfield University. She has been teaching for the last 5 years in bilingual education and is presently employed by the Bridgeport Public School System. Ms. Ocasio will answer several questions for us. First, who is the English language learner? Then, are English language learners properly evaluated to identify learning disabilities? And finally, are teachers properly prepared to identify the linguistic skills and disabilities of the English language learner? Ms. Ocasio?
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. English language learners are students with a primary language other than English who are limited English proficient. These students come from different cultural backgrounds that do not have an understanding or have not been exposed to a second language. In order for these students to acquire the second language, they must be taught in a very distinctive way compared to regular education students. Bilingual education students have other languages and other cultures. These students have only a 30-month period in a bilingual program to acquire English as a second language. The short time frame the students have in a bilingual program makes a difference in acquiring the second language. The educator has to rush through the instructional program without giving the child the necessary instructional time for a child to master fluency in his native language, something that can assist in acquiring the second language with effectiveness. Research suggests that if the child is not fluent in his native language, this will not be of any help, for this can create a mental block for the student to demonstrate native language and English proficiency. The state of Connecticut allows only 30 months for a student to acquire the second language proficiently. English language learners take longer than 30 months to acquire a second language. So by limiting their second language acquisition, we are not being fair to the students' learning capacity. There are certain academic requirements of language, and these requirements relate to the idea of communicative competence. There are two different levels of language proficiency. There is the basic interpersonal communication skills, known as BICS, and cognitive academic language proficiency skills, known as CALPS. Many misconceptions about student abilities, capabilities, and even basic intelligence are related to the way in which language proficiency has been defined. Specifically, students' conversational fluency in English is often taken as a reflection of their overall proficiency in the language. The basic interpersonal communication skills involves using language for a social, face-to-face, everyday situation. It tends to be very contextualized, providing abundant clues to comprehension. It refers to basic fluency in the language and is acquired relatively quickly, usually within 2 to 3 years. But that is not the most important part of academic requirements. I believe the main priority here is how does a student acquire the cognitive academic language, which involves language skills and functions of an academic or cognitive nature. This is the language needed to accomplish academic tasks in the classroom. There are fewer context clues, and students must draw meaning from language itself. CALP takes much longer to acquire, about 5 to 7 years. CALP, however, is highly transferable from one language to another. If you have cognitive proficiency in one language, you simply need to acquire the matching language labels for these ideas in a second language for transfer to occur. These bilingual students should have a balance between these two to be successful. Students entering a district are assessed by the Language Dominance Classification Assessment to determine if this child is proficient in English. This does not measure if a child is learning disabled. This assessment is done in English only. English language learners are frequently mistaken for students with special needs. Their academic difficulties can be directly attributed to deficiencies in the teaching and learning environment. Students with limited English may fail because they do not have access to effective bilingual or English as a second language instruction. Other students may have learning difficulties stemming from linguistic or cultural differences. Still, some students need specialized instruction because of specific learning disabilities. Many educators have difficulty distinguishing students who truly have learning disabilities from students who are failing for other reasons, such as limited English. This may lead to a referral without seeking the appropriate classroom interventions. The Individuals with Disability Educational Act, which represents students with special needs, stipulates that before a school determines that a student has a learning disability, it must ascertain that the student has had sufficient opportunity to learn, including adequate instruction in a language that the student can understand. School personnel involved in placement decisions tend to disregard this clause, paying insufficient attention to the influence of a student's native language, ignoring the ecology of the student's regular education classroom, and only sporadically implementing pre-referral strategies. In addition, school personnel are inconsistent in their use of pre-referral interventions designed to provide students with additional assistance before evaluating them for special education. The intent of early intervention is to create general education support systems for struggling learners as a way to improve academic performance and to reduce inappropriate special education referrals. English language learners who need special education services are further disadvantaged by the shortage of special educators who are trained to address their language and disability-related needs simultaneously. Improving the academic performance of students who come from non-English backgrounds require a focus on the prevention of failure and on early intervention for struggling learners. We must meet the needs of these English language learners to ensure that students meet their academic potential. Prevention of failure among English language learners involves two critical elements. First, the creation of educational environments that are conducive to their academic success. Second, the use of instructional strategies known to be effective with these students. All students can learn, and educators are responsible for helping them learn. We educators can come to understand the social, linguistic, and cultural context in which the children are being raised. Several factors are necessary to obtain superior academic performance in English language learners. Among them, strong administrative leadership, high expectations for student achievement, challenging appropriate curricula and instruction, a safe and orderly environment, ongoing systematic evaluation of student progress, and shared decision-making among ESL teachers, general education teachers, administrators, and parents. Parents of students learning English must be viewed as capable advocates for their children and as valuable resources in school improvement efforts. The anticipated outcomes of problem prevention strategies and early intervention include the following: a reduction in the number of students perceived to be at risk by general education teachers because of teachers' increased ability to accommodate the naturally occurring diversity of skills and characteristics of students in their classes. A reduction in the number of students inappropriately referred to remedial or special education programs. A reduction in the number of students inaccurately identified as having a disability improve student outcomes in both general and special education. The test performance of culturally and linguistically diverse students may be affected by the differential interpretation of questions, their lack of familiarity with vocabulary, limited English language proficiency, and issues of language dominance are other areas that affect their academic success. As I mentioned earlier, even students who have demonstrated English fluency on oral language measures may not be ready to demonstrate their achievement on tests at higher cognitive levels in English if they haven't met their cognitive academic language proficiency. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ocasio. From what I gather, it seems necessary for all teachers to have some type of knowledge of language acquisition and in order for them to meet the needs of their students, of their English language learners. Thank you. Our next presenter, Ms. Ann Rosa, holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Rhode Island. and a master's degree in TESOL from Fairfield University. Ms. Rosa will share with us the models used in bilingual education. Ms. Rosa?
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. There are several models of bilingual education. As time is limited, I will speak about 3 models that are commonly used in our Connecticut school systems: the transitional program, the ESL pullout, also known as English as a Second Language model, and the dual immersion program. I will briefly discuss sheltered English instruction and 2 learning approaches, the SIOP and CALA models. The transitional model is commonly known as a 30-month program, whereas the English language learner has primary instruction in the person's L1 or native language, for instance, Spanish, for 1 to 3 academic years. Instruction in the primary language should provide a foundation in literacy and academic content that will facilitate the student acquiring the new language and develop academically at the same time. Typically, in the first year, the bilingual teacher may teach and speak 80% of the time in the student's primary language, like Portuguese or Spanish, and 20% of the time in English. The second year, the teacher may teach and speak 50-50 in each language. And the third year, the teacher may speak and teach in the native language 20% of the time and English 80% of the time. After 30 months, it is expected that the student will be ready to have all academic instruction be in English. The objective is to support the student learning with his or her native language when needed and to slowly have the second language take over as the language of instruction. The goal is to develop the English language skills for the English language learners as soon as possible. The ESL pullout model enables the English language learners to receive the majority of instruction in the regular classroom with their English-speaking peers. However, they are pulled out of the classroom on a regular basis to receive additional help from an English as a second language teacher or educational assistant. This may be in the form of English language development activities as well as reinforcement of content area material. The goal is to help students become proficient in oral and written English. However, in some of our districts, the ESL teacher collaborates with the bilingual or regular education teacher by going to that specific classroom. The student is not pulled out, but rather the English instruction is pushed in. The dual language immersion model, or two-way bilingual program, integrates the native English speaker and native speakers of another language for all or most of the day. Both groups learn together in 2 languages. For instance, the English and Spanish languages are both used 50-50 for academic and content instruction. The goal is for all students to become bilingual, biliterate, and bicultural. Cultural awareness, appreciation, and acceptance are emphasized throughout the curriculum. This model is currently being used successfully in several districts throughout the state. Sheltered English is an instructional approach to teaching core content curricula to English language learners. Grade-level content instruction is in English, while second language learning strategies are used to assist in acquiring English. Strategies include the use of realia, props, visuals, media, body language, and gestures to get the content to be comprehensible to the student. The student may actively participate in cooperative groups, peer reviews, and editing. To make the content area comprehensible, the teacher may modify the rate of speech, check for understanding frequently, select and emphasize key vocabulary, and limit use of slang. Instruction may be organized around theme ideas. Culture and content instruction may be integrated as needed. The strategy should assist the student in developing his or her higher order thinking skills and advanced literacy skills. However, it is necessary that the student have a foundation in the first language to transfer these academic skills to the second language. Sham and O'Malley introduced in 1994 an instructional model that focuses directly and specifically on teaching and learning strategies that assist the students in becoming independent learners. This model is called Cognitive Academic Language Learning Approach, also known as CALA. Metacognitive, cognitive, and social affective strategies give the English language learner the tools to be successful academically in the content areas. CALA is most used with intermediate and advanced beginner English language learners. The CALA model includes 3 components and instructional objectives in its curricular and instructional design. Topics from the major content subjects, which should be authentic according to grade level. The development of academic language skills and explicit instruction in learning strategies for both content and language acquisition. Related instructional concepts include language across the curriculum, the language experience approach, whole language, process writing, cooperative learning, and cognitive instruction, as CALA is based on cognitive theory and research. A teacher may start using CALA first with a science curriculum because science uses lots of hands-on activities and observations, followed by math as it has many universal symbols common to many languages, then social sciences, and finally language arts. The Shelter Instruction Observation Protocol, also known as the SIOP model, is a tool or guide that ESL, regular education, and content area teachers may use to teach content effectively to ELLs. Echevarria, Voigt, and Short researched the fields of ESL, bilingual education, reading, language, and literacy acquisition, special education, and classroom management to develop this model to provide solid examples of sheltered instruction to enhance and expand teachers' instructional practice. The protocol is composed of 30 items grouped into 3 main sections. First, preparation of lesson planning, including language and content objectives. Second, instructional practices which are critical for English language learners, such as incorporating the student's prior knowledge, emphasizing key vocabulary, promoting higher order thinking skills, and providing hands-on materials. And third, review and assessment, which evaluates the lesson plan in terms of was there a comprehensive review of vocabulary and key concepts? Was regular feedback provided to students on their work? Were the students learning the lesson objectives and comprehending instruction consistently throughout the plan? Each individual category is scored using a rubric to determine how effective the teacher is meeting the linguistic and academic needs of the English language learner. Not every item needs to be present in the daily lesson, and the ESL or regular education teacher may choose to focus on one part of the SIOP model at a time. This model simply provides a framework for well-prepared and well-delivered sheltered lessons for any content area. There is room for creativity for both the teacher and the student. The teacher tailors the strategies to fit the student's needs and abilities. The key is making sure the language and content objectives are being met. I've just briefly highlighted the 3 bilingual education models of dual language immersion, English as a second language pullout, transitional programs, and the sheltered English instruction approach. The CALA and SIOP models each present a successful learning approach that regular education may use with English language learners. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rosa, for sharing the bilingual educational models with us. The bilingual educational models ensure that our English language learners have some type of service or support in our school system. Thank you. Congress has recently passed legislation known as No Child Left Behind. Unfortunately, the discussions are minimal about what legislation means for the linguistically diverse student. To present this topic, we have Maria Sosa. Ms. Sosa holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Latin American Studies and a Master's degree in Education from the State University of New York in Binghamton. She has been an educator for 14 years and is currently employed by the Stanford Public School System in Connecticut. Ms. Sosa, how relevant is the legislation on No Child Left Behind for the linguistically diverse student?
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. I think that No Child Left Behind is extremely relevant to our second language learners. The No Child Left Behind legislation passed in 2002 is the largest attempt by the federal government to reform the educational system. It is specifically designed to address the educational gaps that currently exist in our schools. Specifically, No Child Left Behind amends or revamps the earlier Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 by focusing on 4 areas: accountability for results, doing what works, based on scientific research, expanded parental options, and expanded local control. To that end, billions of dollars have been set aside for grants under the now named Title I. States will have greater flexibility in the use of federal funding and defining what is adequate yearly progress for schools and districts within the parameters and time frames set by Title I. Research shows that later reading problems can be prevented by early intervention. A major emphasis of No Child Left Behind, therefore, is on early literacy in order to ensure that children do, in fact, have the right start. One program that is slated to receive a great deal of support is the Reading First initiative, which will provide funding for reading teachers in the early grades. The accountability piece of the legislation requires assessments that are aligned with state curriculum and academic achievement standards, and which are given at specific intervals. Annual testing for all students in grades 3 through 8 is required. The measurements are meant to show children's academic progress as well as provide teachers with a clearer profile of students' progress. Such profiles should guide instructional practice. Data collected must be provided to parents. In addition, achievement data must be broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, English language proficiency, disability, and other socioeconomic indicators to ensure that no one group is left behind. Part of the accountability piece also requires data on teacher credentials and qualifications, as well as calls for continued professional development. States must develop plans to ensure that all teachers of core academic subjects, reading, math, language arts, be qualified by the end of the 2005-2006 school year. Annual report cards must include progress made towards maintaining a highly qualified faculty. Minimum requirements for paraprofessionals are also part of the accountability piece. I would now like to address how No Child Left Behind affects second language learners in particular. In general, No Child Left Behind provides two options for servicing limited English language proficient students. The first option allows the Bilingual Education Act of 1968 to continue, however with little or no increase in funding. The second option facilitates the replacing of traditional bilingual programs with instructional programs that emphasize rapid acquisition of the English language. Approximately $650 million would have to be allocated annually to support this latter option through a formula grant system. Obviously, this formula grant system marks a policy change in how programs for second language learners will be designed and funded. Another change brought about by the formula grant system for financing English language programs is that states with growing second language learners in their school populations will have more access and will not lose out to states which traditionally had larger limited English proficient populations, like California, New York, and Texas. Specifically, bilingual and migrant education programs are to be consolidated under two types of agencies and approaches to funding. State educational agencies will administer formula grants that support instructional programs, while federally administered grants will provide for professional development. No Child Left Behind also requires that states and local districts take the same care collecting data about second language learners' progress. Their performance in all state-mandated tests, as well as progress in English language acquisition, must be part of the larger accountability piece mandated by No Child Left Behind. In addition to annual reports, however, states receiving Title III funds must also submit biannual reports showing the number and percentages of limited English proficient students achieving English proficiency, as well as follow those students in the 2 years after exiting English language programs. In addition, No Child Left Behind increases local school districts' obligations to inform parents about English learner programs. No Child Left Behind has also renamed the Federal Bilingual Education Office to the now called Office of English Language Acquisition, Language Enhancement, and Academic Achievement for Limited English Proficient Students. Part of that agency's responsibility, is to set aside funding for language programs for Native Americans as well. An important way that the allocation of funding will affect instructional programs for second language learners is in the types of programs supported. Title III explicitly states that the Education Department should neither mandate nor preclude the use of a particular curricular or pedagogical approach to teaching second language learners. It allows for states and school districts to interpret which pedagogies or approaches to implement. Dual language immersion approaches may benefit the most, as the trend in recent years seems to be a retreat from transitional bilingual programs. So we may see an increase in programs that teach two languages to mixed populations of learners. The largest immediate impact may be with respect to testing. No Child Left Behind requires all states to administer tests to measure oral proficiency as well as test reading and writing skills. Beginning in the 2002 to 2003 school year, all students, regardless of their time of arrival, must be tested for language proficiency as well as in the areas of reading, language arts, and mathematics. In Connecticut, No Child Left Behind overrides 99-11, which allowed a 10-month exemption for newly arrived students from regular standardized testing. States do have the option of accommodating limited English speakers by giving extended time, and they may even include native language versions of the assessments for students with less than 3 years enrollment in a U.S. school system. How individual states choose to accommodate assessing their English language learners will demonstrate their sensitivity to these learners' needs and their understanding of the acquisition of a second language. Our hope is that the research on second language acquisition will truly be considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sosa. No Child Left Behind is a very hot topic in the education field. Unfortunately, it seems that the English language learners do not benefit from this law as much as their counterparts when it comes to assessment.
I would agree, and I think actually they're probably going to be overburdened by the additional testing.
Thank you, Ms. Sosa.
You're welcome.
At this time, we will turn to our audience for questions.
Ms. Spencer, we've heard a lot about what they do in this country. Could you tell us a little about how they teach in other countries?
Yes, that's actually a very interesting question. In other countries, there are plenty of them that have a high immigrant population or that have more than one national language, and therefore they do need to have these language programs. And in other countries, what they do, although we don't know specifically what the different programs are, we do know that when they're doing language instruction, that they stick to the person's native language, and they work a lot in the content area with that person's native language. The first year, perhaps 80% of the content would be taught in the native language, and then they're slowly moving towards working in the content area in the new language. And I think that's really different from what we do here in the United States, in that our focus is really to push students toward the new language. And in other countries, what we're seeing is that they really focus on trying to preserve the native language, work through the native language for the students to learn the content areas, to really focus on more of a cultural awareness, a cultural appreciation for either the person's native, or if there's, two languages, two cultures in that country, to really focus on embracing both of those cultures.
Ms. Ocasio, I have a question. What type of training is being given to mainstream teachers to help the English language learner?
Currently, they are being trained through staff developments, and the staff developments is where they bring in all the teachers and they actually teach them different strategies, advise them as far as the different structures they have to use in the classroom. They also have teacher activities through grade level meetings. They each meet twice a week, and there they discuss how they did implementing these strategies they did learn through staff development. It takes time, but it's a yearly process. They have staff developments 6 to 8 times a year. So it's going to be productive.
Thank you.
Ms.
Can I just
Rosa?
add something to that? I just wanted to say that it's not only these people that work in bilingual programs or ESL programs that are getting the professional developments. There is, they're trying to get everybody involved in this. I was at a professional development just last week where it was the whole school. Every teacher, every mainstream teacher is learning how to include English language learners and work towards being a little more sensitive to English language learners. And a lot of the teachers, when we were at the professional development, worked on how they can just use, small strategies in a mainstream classroom to help them out a little bit. And a lot of the teachers said it was things they never thought about but are very simple to implement in a classroom, which provides additional support in these programs.
Ms. Rosa, which model is most successful for English language learners?
I'm glad you asked that question. Just recently, Wayne Thomas and Virginia Collier completed a study, a longitudinal study in 5 different school districts and in California. It was over a 5-year period, and the information was just released this year, showing that dual immersion is by far the most successful in teaching these English language learners the dominant language for that school. Next would come transitional bilingual education, and at the bottom is the sink or swim method, that being a child just put into a monolingual classroom with no supports and is left on their own with basically little support in learning the new language of this, the school, and especially the academic language. So they're just left on their own. So this is what's been given so far in research.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question before we conclude our discussion. Ms. Sosa, did you want to add something before
Yes, I
we go
did,
on?
and I wanted to piggyback on both what Ms. Rosa said and what Ms. Spencer mentioned with regard to other countries. I have worked in bilingual education now for over 10 years in both transitional programs and the sink or swim method. I've also observed dual language immersion programs, and I can attest to the fact that the first 2 models work very well when they have the proper support. And part of that support is giving the time that students need that other countries seem to be giving.
Our last question.
Ms. Sosa, you were talking earlier about the schools needing to meet the adequate yearly progress. I would like to know what will happen to the schools if they do not meet the adequate yearly progress you mentioned earlier.
Okay, well, part of the No Child Left Behind is the stipulation that schools set bars of achievement for their students. If after 2 years, a school having been identified as not meeting the achievement levels set for them by the school district, parents are notified and given the option of having their child enrolled in another district school that is meeting the achievement levels. And if after an additional year of that, actually an additional 2 years of that, then the schools are required to design improvement plans. Parents again are notified that and given the choice to re-enroll their child in another school in the district. By the 5th year, however, faculty may be replaced, either partially or whole. Some schools have been turned into charter schools, so that it is something that would impact on all students in low-performing schools.
This concludes our discussion on the perspectives of English language learning and enhancing teachers' awareness. I'd like to thank the panel, Ms. Spencer, Ms. Ocasio, Ms. Rosa, and Ms. Sosa for a wonderful presentation. I'd also like to thank the audience for their participation and our viewers for watching. We hope you enjoyed our presentation. Thank you.